Hello and welcome. You're with the Economic Times. My name is Ashutosh Sinha, and I welcome you to this very interesting topic today. Very interesting because of multiple reasons. So let me first explain. So today, it's the Economic Times and Sophos present Enhance the Digital Supply Chain Security Roundtable. So if you're a leader in any company that caters to B2C or a B2B market, whether you're a buyer, supplier, small or large business, this should be of interest to you. None of you would want to find a mention in the context of supply chain being disrupted or compromised or something like that. Unfortunately, the magnitude and the instances of such disruptions is increasing. It is clear that supply chain security needs strong oversight and controls to ensure its security. But what are the times are we living in right now? The business landscape is returning to normal as things are beginning to open up, or call it the new normal, if you will, as organizations look to scale up to seize the opportunity. The risks that supply chain is facing is only enhanced. It must also balance large and complex global networks alongside the staff and budget constraints if one is to enhance the security. And of course, not to forget the unforeseen circumstances like disruption or denial of service or whatever. At the same time, there is a consistent demand from governments, customers, employees, and the entire ecosystem for increased transparency and visibility into the supply chain. So one part of it is asking for more, one wants to give away lesser. That's the challenge that companies and the top management are facing. So with more and more external touch points that the supply chains are exposed to, the opportunity for increased risk needs to be assessed, managed, and these are some of the reasons why the topic enhance the digital supply chain security becomes so important for companies. The experts here today will talk about the various aspects around it. And if you're following us on any of the platforms, you should make sure that you post your questions for the experts. So let me tell you about the experts we have today. Pawan Chawla is CISO at Future Generali Indian Insurance Company. Avinash Prasad, Vice President and Head for Managed Security Services and Content Delivery Networks at Tata Communications. Sandeep Kulkarni, he's CISO and VP IT and Cloud Operations at iCertis. Sachin Lala, Head of Engineering at Blackhawk Network. Anirban Sengupta, Partner Cybersecurity at PwC India. And John Shear, Senior Security Advisor, Sophos. We also will be joined in just a little while by Unique Kumar. He's CISO at CK Birla Group of Companies. And as I mentioned, he'll join us in a little bit, just a little bit from now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. First, let me request, if I can, go across to John and ask him for a welcome address, please. John, it's over to you.
Thank you, Ashu. And welcome everybody to this panel session. As Ashu said, supply chain is one of those things, those topics of conversation that's become more and more prevalent in the discussion about cybersecurity these days. As everyone knows, ransomware is one of those things that has just ravaged the world in terms of the economic damage that it's done, but also in terms of the resources it has consumed for organizations of every size and in every industry. And the recent ransomware attacks that we're seeing are really showing how a lot of organizations are vulnerable, not only within themselves, but across to their partners and some of the people they do business with, and how those bring risks in as well. The reality is that ransomware is not going away. We got a little bit, well, we think we got a little bit of good news recently with the Revel gang announcing their shutdown. But what that really means is there's going to be another ransomware gang, another set of criminals that are waiting in the wings, waiting to take their place and to do just as much damage as these guys have done over the course of their operating years. And we've also seen a recent report from the US government, the Department of Treasury, saying that ransomware is nearly a $6 billion enterprise. So there's a lot of financial motivation, if you will, for these criminals and these operators to keep going and try to infect as many of our networks as possible. And the fact is that while ransomware attacks in terms of sheer numbers have gone down over the years, what has replaced that is that quantity is the quality. It's the way in which these ransomware criminals are getting into our networks. They're penetrating them a lot more deeply, and they're adding different layers of extortion. So when in the past we had very simply just your files getting encrypted or your systems maybe being disrupted, now you're getting your data stolen. Now you're getting the ransomware criminals are involving people from the media. They're involving people, your employees. They're using people outside of your industry or outside of your company in order to pressure you into paying more money. And the fact is the costs of ransomware have gone up year on year. They've doubled from last year. And as a matter of fact, when it comes to India specifically, they've doubled over the global average from last year as well, rising to just over $3 million US. And India is also at the top of the list when it comes to organizations that have been hit by ransomware. As I said, there's no country, no industry, no size of company that is too small or too big to be considered a target. Everybody is a target when it comes to ransomware. And where we see these things come together, the supply chain and ransomware, is where it becomes worrying, as I mentioned before. Some of these dangers might be lurking in your partners' networks that are connecting to you, or unfortunately, it might be you're bringing risk to somebody else's network by being vulnerable yourself. And so as we're seeing the costs of ransomware rise, as we're seeing the amount of cooperation and connection across the world rise as well through business partnerships and through data sharing partnerships, we're also seeing all these risks together rise within the organizations and introduce more potential for ransomware criminals to make money. So right now, what we want to discuss and what we're going to be doing today is talking about some of these risks, talking about how we can potentially reduce these risks. You can't eliminate them all, but you've got to be able to reduce as much of them as possible, how you can mitigate them. And then we're going to hear from some of the panelists about some of the successes they've had in their organizations at combating ransomware, the supply chain compromise issues, and just generally making cybersecurity more of a priority within their organizations so that they can be safer and protect their business partners as well. So I'll pass it back to you, Ashu, and good luck everybody in the panel.
Okay, thanks so much, John, for your note. Let's go across now. It's time to get a sense of what the entire context is, because as John mentioned, the numbers may tell you some story, but the quality is what matters. So let me invite and request Anirban to step in now and do a little bit of a context setting on what is happening around this. Anirban, it's over to you.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Good afternoon, everyone. So supply chain security is not new. Organizations have always relied on third-party suppliers to carry out their business functions. For example, if you look at the automobile industry, they follow a just-in-time inventory model, and they have been doing it for the last 10-15 years or so. The suppliers are required to deliver parts a few days or even few hours before they are consumed in production. The suppliers often have access to the stock positions, ERP applications, and so on. And they typically work in an extended network environment. Global supply chains have become increasingly interconnected, and even before the pandemic, but now it is even more so. This increases the risk of supply chain attacks. In this type of attacks, attackers infiltrate the third-party suppliers and exploit their trusted access to gain access to your environment. Once inside, they can do anything. They can conduct all sorts of malicious activities. And if you look at, as John mentioned, the supply chain attacks have increased significantly during the recent months. So what are the thoughts which are coming to my mind when I think about supply chain attacks? Number one, it is trust versus security or restrictions. Or in other words, it is enable versus block or isolate. So let me try to explain this. Let us look at cyber attacks, which are difficult to prevent. If you ask me, I will say insider threats or insider attacks are difficult to prevent and discover. Similarly, supply chain attacks can be difficult to prevent and discover. The reason is that in both these cases, there is a concept of trust. For example, we trust our employees, we trust our business partners. And that is why it is not very easy for our organizations to address this conflict. The second thing which is coming to my mind is about the circle of control versus the circle of influence and the circle of concern. We all know that whatever is within the circle of control, it represents things that we can directly do. We can do it ourselves. For example, my internal security controls, my internal security safeguards. I can implement the way I want. But what about supply chain attacks? Can I determine the control or safeguards which my supplier should have to prevent such attacks? Unfortunately, the answer is no in most of the cases. In some cases, of course, it comes under my circle of influence. I can influence my business practice to follow certain practices, technologies, and so on. But in most cases, it's a circle of concern. The next point which comes to my mind is about the heterogeneous world which is there. If you look at large organizations, large brands, they have tens and thousands of suppliers. The suppliers can be large or small. Their security maturity can vary as well. Some of them might be quite mature, some of them may not. So how do we handle such complex, diverse environments? That is that is something again organizations typically grapple with. And number four, if I look at it, is the kind of complexity to deal with this, the kind of complexity and the efforts. Let's talk about this. So unlike any other cyber attacks or most of the other cyber attacks, here in this case, there are two entities which are impacted. There are two entities which are compromised. The life cycle of a supply chain attack has two main parts: the attack which has happened on the supplier and the attack which has happened on the consumer. So it is not about handling the breach or the compromise for one organization. And and that is often the difficult part. And this is what, when we talk about supply chain security, supply chain breaches and attacks, this is what which sets it apart compared to any other cyber attacks or breaches. It is not surprising that ENISA, which is the European Agency for Cybersecurity, they published a report this year. And they said that 62% of the attacks on customers, it took advantage of their trust in their supplier. So it's a breach of trust which has happened. I have created a trusted environment and the attackers have compromised the trust which is there. In a nutshell, organizations need to update their cybersecurity methodology. They have to bring supply chain as part of this methodology. They have to incorporate all the suppliers in the fold. They have to take care of the protection and security verification. And finally, I will say that whenever we talk about supply chain security, preventive control we know is always the best, but prevention may not be enough in these cases. There has to be place for detection, respond, and recover. And finally, we speak about zero trust security in a COVID world. So zero trust security is best applied here. So with this, I will hand it back to you, Ashu, for the remaining part of the session.
Okay, thanks so much. And since you referred to COVID and the COVID times, these pandemic times, We also have Unique Kumar from CK Birla Group joining us. He's CISO at CK Birla Group. Unique, thanks so much for being with us and joining us, even though you are on the way on a business travel, and you still have made sure that you could join us. So if you're good, we can start with you, Unique. Since
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Anirban referred to, in the kind of situation that we are in, zero trust, how do companies build that zero trust? Look at the current times as a new beginning so that the enhanced needs of today can be factored into their planning process.
Sure. See, the cyber attacks now are evolving from past 1.5 years. We all know the fact. And supply chain attacks are really growing day by day. The problem nowadays is the technology has been implemented by most of the organizations. But the ground reality is the technology is not a silver bullet which can solve all the problems. You can implement EDR, you can implement the high-end advanced firewalls. You can build zero trust until and unless you train the human firewall, which are your employees. It is very difficult for a CISO, for a CIO to prevent those attacks, because think from the angle of the hacker. How hacker would enter to the organization? Hacker would always try to enter by the weakest link, and the weakest link is human. You will get an email, and that email will have a malicious link. And when you open that malicious link, it looks like nothing had happened. But at the back end, there's a backdoor, which you allow to enter through your systems. And now what will happen? From one system to another system, from another to third system, slowly, gradually, all the systems are getting impacted. So the point which I want to make out here is, you can implement zero trust. Yes, it is very good. It is a must to have. Take an example of two-factor authentication. What is two-factor authentication? It is a one part of zero trust, because you are not only believing on the passwords, but you also want that there is a unique code which even you don't know what you are going to enter in the system. So that is something which is required nowadays. So I would always focus on the awareness, and the CISO CIO can only work in a collaboration with the HRs of the company. So let's say if every HR put for every employee a KRF 10% of the cybersecurity trainings, then what will happen? The seriousness and the awareness will increase like anything.
Correct.
And people will think before they're doing any activity. So what I have also found that people are doing. So I'll tell you a very interesting example. So there was a lady who was residing in Gurgaon, and she was living in a one-room apartment wherein she was coming back from office and doing some personal stuff. She also got a friend on the Facebook wherein they both doing the chats, exchanging the messages. What had happened? The person who don't know where he was sitting, so he sent one link to the lady and she clicked on that. Nothing had happened. After a few weeks, she started getting calls, threatening calls, and she also got some photographs in not in a good situation, which she was not expecting. So she spoke to HR, then they went to cyber cell and had launched a complaint also. Lately, it is realized that system was compromised. So the hacker who was put some backdoor on our system are having a full control, and with a camera which is there, the person was able to see what she was doing in the one-room apartment. So I mean, there is no limit to the cyber attacks. Recently, I was reading, in UAE, there is an attack which had happened using an AI-based voice recognition system, wherein the hacker used the phishing technique, and then sent a message by changing the voice of the person, and it was a fraud, like the fraud.
Get your point.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not so easy, and then the role, well, among many other who are there, telcos. At some stage, telcos come in. Avinash, how important is it for telcos and telecom networks to work closely with companies in ensuring the solution that you're offering that could be top, because that has to keep evolving all the time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Firstly, welcome everyone, and good afternoon to all the people also joining and witnessing the event. So, if you look at it, right, firstly, just a definition of, as you said, right, telco also sounds a little bit old world, right? Frankly, the world is all about internet, right? So that's where everything seems to have gone. Everybody loves digital, organizations, individuals. We all want to make best use of the internet and all the cloud services that are available. So what that has done for service providers like us also is we are really looking at the entire gamut of digital services. When you look at that, suddenly, connectivity takes on different connotations. Performance takes on different connotations. End subscriber, end user expectations are getting higher and higher with the penetration of the internet, with the digital literacy, rapidly increasing, especially if we talk about local region, the India market, but of course, uh, far beyond that as well. So what we saw was, and we spoke about the past 18 months kind of scenario, right, as we were starting the conversation, that there was a big spike in the consumption for very obvious reasons. Then the next thing was the fact that yes, the context of, and we heard from organizations like manufacturing organizations who had no concept of remote working, and suddenly they had to see how to, not all maybe, but some of them didn't have, many processes were not available to be done remotely. So they had to look at how to make all of that work. For example, Anirban spoke about automobile industry and the fact that there has been always close working and dependency on suppliers. So what that meant was the internet-based collaboration model, the software supply chain, and the integrated services came more and more to the fore, right? And moving more from and more in kind of a sudden spike or in a sudden jump, making that leap towards much more connected and a digitally enabled kind of organization, not fully prepared for it, maybe not all the underlying processes being there. And then from there we saw the some of these high impact events suddenly coming up, as we've examined briefly through the talk from John as well as from Anirban and Unique, that the concept of firstly malware, ransomware, then and ransomware is not very new. I mean, WannaCry, Petya, XYZ. We've been seeing stuff, but getting innovative and finding new delivery mechanisms of ensuring that they're really able to propagate this is what we were seeing. So what that meant was for somebody like me, let's say, in the role of enabling the digital connectivity and services for the customers that Tata Comm serves, but driving cybersecurity as a services approach, as a framework, and as a managed service became very, very important in terms of building up the layers of support that could be offered to organizations around that. Now there are certain core things that for sure we can't do. Just the good basic practices of having the right kind of data backups in case of the question of recovery comes in from a ransomware attack. But in terms of being able to participate in the way systems can be managed, quarantined, the way attack proliferation can be stopped or stemmed, and and then kind of the whole process of response and recovery can take over is something that we've really seen it evolve. I think one observation was correctly made, possibly by John, that India is seeing a very high percentage also of this thing. So we saw that also in terms of the percentage of ransomware attack. I wouldn't say very high impact in terms of high value, but for sure volume is high. So the level of preparedness that we need to have, I think there's enough visibility around that. There are roles that different partners can play, and that's where we need to see how to kind of take this forward in the digital services and connected world.
Okay, so I think John, the way it is being described now, it could be so multifaceted. This kind of an attack, if it's AI driven, if it is email, is sort of passe, I would say. But if there are so many forms of that, the tech team and perhaps the experts from outside need to work even more closely along with the processes that need to be put in place. How complex is that challenge for an average company?
Yeah, so let me answer that question just by addressing some of the points that were made previously, because I think there's a lot of good information that's been given by my panelists here. Zero trust is one of these things that is a contextual framework. It relies on having information from all the various parts of your organization, all the devices, everything that connects and contacts your organization needs to be involved in order to have a successful zero trust implementation. And what that introduces is a problem of visibility when we talk about hybrid and remote work. So when we're talking about communications, having all these people working now from maybe a mobile phone as opposed to a laptop, you're potentially losing some of that visibility. So you've got to reintroduce some of that visibility into the framework in order to be doing zero trust properly and understanding the context under which people are accessing your resources. So the fact that I log in every single day between the hours of, let's say, 8 and 5 from Canada, that's my usual context. And I use a Windows system, and that's my usual context. But if all of a sudden I'm coming from Australia in off hours, then that context is wrong, and therefore now you can have a bit of a better understanding of maybe something's happening in my network, and it's that visibility that I'm talking about. So when we talk about trying to deal with that problem, you can see where the complexity rises, because not only do you have to keep track, as we did in the past, of the endpoints and the users and maybe the resources they're trying to access, but now we have to start looking at all the services that are connecting into my organization. So if you've got any things like APIs that are connecting from talking about supply chains, right? You might have some code that is moving back and forth between different partners. You've got some APIs that are connecting in. Well, is that API doing the right, is it making the right connection at the right time and accessing the right resources? The perimeter has vanished, right? So there is no perimeter anymore. There's not this firewall that you can wrap around all of your devices, because everybody is everywhere, especially during a pandemic when everybody's doing either hybrid or remote work. And so now we need to have sort of visibility into all the devices that are being used, in addition to the activities of the users that are using those devices, in addition to the authenticity of those users as well. So that's where multi-factor authentication that was mentioned earlier is really important as well. It's one of the big pillars of zero trust, is having that additional factor and having additional ways of authenticating people. So as we move to these I'll call them disconnected, but I'm using that in a specific way, meaning we are now no longer in the same physical location. We are disconnected. We're spread out from each other. But increasingly, we're more connected because we're using more ways of getting into the organization digitally. And so the problem now becomes, how do you keep track of all those signals? How do you make sense of them? And from a technology standpoint, you've mentioned AI from an adversarial standpoint, but AI is one of those things that we can process signals at scale in a very reliable way to start to understand if there are things that are happening that are suspicious or malicious within the network, that then we can set the humans on. And that's the really important part in this zero trust framework, and this complex attack scenario, is having man and machine work together. The human versus the machine with the machine is much better than the human or the machine by themselves. And so in the EDR scenario, where that last piece, the R, is the respond, that's the humans that are taking control and taking the signals from the technology, saying there's something odd happening here. John's logging in from Australia when he should be asleep on a Linux laptop. I need a human to look at that. And that's when the investigation starts, where you look, what else is going on in my network? And these are the kinds of things we have to do, is we have to take the technology and apply human understanding and human skills to dig deeper and have a broader understanding of what's actually happening in the network.
Okay, so it's getting more complex, clearly. So let's take Sachin's view on that. Sachin, if you can explain how easy or difficult is it for us, when I say it means companies, how easy or difficult it is for them to set up and change the way systems are being designed.
Sure, Ashu. Thanks for having me here. First of all, welcome on. I think very good points made. I'm going to pick a few points which I think are worth elaborating. I think the very fundamental point, Ashu, I'd first make is that this is one of those things wherein we must admire the problem enough first, right? Because before getting into the solution, it's very important that an organization is looking at it as a very paramount thing which can actually literally break everything else, right? There are enough incidents and things that are out there which signify how wrong this can go. So in that spirit, I think 2 points. One is we need to have an orientation which basically says if I'm impacted, my company is impacted, that's probably not just about it. There could be a cascaded impact elsewhere as well. So it's a collective responsibility. I think somewhere a point was made around that. I think that's very important to view it as a collective responsibility. It's not just that you're doing some secure aspect to your particular fabric. It's beyond that, right? And second, I think before I get into the technical aspect of it, I just would like to mention, I think there is enough room for improvement or an opportunity wherein we will be able to say that, is there adequate staffing available, right? Wherein when John mentioned the human check, right, that is happening, right? We have a series of good number of tools in every which area, be it about API interceptions, be it about scanning of code, be it about scanning of dependencies, series of things are there. But if it's not basically that instrumentation, if that's not getting a human attention on a regular basis, then you have a problem. And then there are two parts to it. I think one is really the awareness part of it, that yes, everybody is actually thinking that this is important from the point, let's say if I take an engineer an example, from the point on what library I'm bringing in and what am I writing. But at the same time, there is a set of folks who you really want to only focus on this aspect, which is there everything going in the right direction with respect to what the security needs to be. And if there's not enough adequate staffing done, I think we'll have a problem. I'm glad to see Unique on the call as a CISO representative. Like it or not, many organizations, we don't have CISOs as such, right? We just simply say, yes, there is a part of an organization which focuses on product security, but that's just typically thin staffed. There are folks who are really just scrambling with different hours and trying to do that. That doesn't do justice to what really the importance this needs to be having, right? So I think one, I would really emphasize on that part, that enough consensus and enough, I think, probably audit-based or so to say regulatory-based work also needs to happen, wherein an organization's question that do you have adequate staffing before anything else to take care of preventing cyber attacks, addressing cyber attacks, being resilient to it, and any form of it, right? The worst form of it is, of course, the ransomware, wherein literally you have to put something out there and you could be in that situation wherein things are really compromised, they've entered your network, right? So I think that's really one thing I would say, which is about the adequate staffing. And before that, of course, the collective responsibility. From there onwards begins the journey about that. I'll probably emphasize, Ashu, in my capacity more on the engineering front, right? Wherein when we are building stuff, we be able to actually say that our definition of done includes this aspect very inherently, right? That there is enough set of tools wired into your fabric, which is saying from the point when the code is submitted, it is going through a scan to the point wherein what it calls and integrates with is going through a dependency check. It is further on secured to the degree on what level of integration certificates or tokens that you would put in. And then it's going through a regular refresh, right? And that's very important as well. Oftentimes this will happen. You would have done everything and you actually feel that you're secure, right? But then guess what? 3 months down the line, somebody somewhere more advanced has figured out a way in, either through a tunneling effect or through figuring out what are the vulnerabilities in the very web server that you're using, other such things. So it's very important to keep up to date and accordingly do a level of refresh. Nothing should be permanent in nature when it comes to identities, certificates, and any kind of tokenization that we do around our technology systems, right? So I can elaborate more on that, but I think these are things.
Okay, Sachin, I'll have to hold on because Unique is at the airport and I think he has a flight to catch.
Sure.
And we must thank him for being able to take out time despite the travel schedule and the commitment to be part of such a conversation. So, Unique, any quick point you'd like to make before you head to the airport or maybe catch the flight?
Yeah. No, thank you, Ashutosh. It is my pleasure to be part of this conference, and thank you so much, Nidhi, for sending the invite. And one thing which I just want to highlight, since digital is growing day by day, and now every organization is talking about digital, I think once the data protection act, which is coming up in next couple of months, or then the things will change like anything. Now the companies are thinking that the CDO should be there, and there will be a time when companies will say that the CISO will be there. And I think that is something where the security stands, because if the digital is there and the security is not in place, things are not getting right. There are a lot of examples available like EKFlex. There are examples like the Route Mobile. So the businesses are taking a deep bad shape due to this cyber attacks. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you,
So
Ashutosh. Thank you
thanks so much. But Unique, before you leave, we'd all love to have a screenshot with you. So if you can just look into all of you, if you can look into the camera, we'd like to preserve it for the future. If you could just look into the camera, each of you, and we can quickly take a screenshot. And of course, we need to smile as well, so that we have that moment of being together on this panel ready for you. Okay, let's move on. Thanks, Unique. And we look forward to being with you again. And thanks indeed for the commitment and being with us on this panel. So let's move on with the conversation.
Thank you.
And let's take on. So I must also remind the viewers, so we'll be taking some polls. So we'd like you to make sure that you register your opinion about some of the questions that we'll ask in the polls. And of course, the questions that you post in the Q&A tab, that can be answered by the expert. So please do post your questions. If you have any specific questions for any one of them, please do mention that as well. So we are talking about the complexity of this entire thing as it's evolving, the supply chain security. So different surveys have now shown that ransomware recovery costs is growing, and some are saying that it's doubling every year. So prevention, it appears, is better than cure. So Pawan Chawla, if you can give a sense of, the insurance industry is one which has traditionally worked with data for many, many years. How does that show up for you? What all is the industry and the company doing to make sure that the protection of data, along with the kinds of data that you have, is extremely important for you?
Thanks, Ashutosh, for asking that question. And it is a very interesting question and also a complex question as well. Why I say it is interesting and complex is insurance is one of the industry which deals with a lot of customer data, whether it is financial, whether it is health, whether it is PI, SPI, in whatever form you want to define it, all kind of data is available with the insurance industry, basis which only the insurance get issued. Now, my co-panelists have talked about the way ransomware have evolved over a period of time. Now, I would like to spend a minute here to put my insight there on an anatomy of a ransomware which goes beyond a hacker's mind. Now, if you look at it, the way ransomware has evolved, now you can have a ransomware bot available on the darknet as at a cost of as low as $40. And if you look at the way they are servicing the dark web, or the service which is provided by the hackers on the dark web is as low as $10 per hour. So you can actually hire a hacker to plot a ransomware in an organization, and they will do end-to-end exercise for you and bill you as per number of hours. And some of the hackers works on a share cost basis as well, where whatever ransomware received, they take a share from you and then provide you all the services which you want. Now, another thing which is very interesting and I would like to highlight here is now the ransomware is not only ransomware. They don't only encrypt data. They have become extortionists as well. So what they do is they encrypt the data, but they steal the data as well. So even if you pay the money, they will again threat you that they will release the data in the darknet unless you pay them ransom. So that has also changed. Now, considering all these aspects, the complexity which we may think is there, for them it is the simplicity. John talked about it, and Anirban spoke about it. Unique also mentioned that they target using the social media platform. They try to reach out to people and the employee of the organization and try to put some kind of a bot within the send some kind of a link, try to create a bot, push the bot within the organization and try to steal the data. Now, what is important is what Unique talked about, and I would like to second that thought, is educating your employees is very much important. Every attack starts from a click, whether you do it in your personal life or you do it in your organization. That is the first entry stage from where an hacker gets in. Now, how do you protect that? If we talk about it, one is definitely the awareness, but awareness is not only, it's not going to resolve the problem. You need to create a cyber security framework for the organization. And within that framework, you need to come up with various training models using the live attacks which are happening in the world, the companies which people have experienced, and give them that kind of a simulation through which they can learn upon. Because not everyone has faced the kind of cyber attack, but everyone must have heard about it, spoke about it, and would have heard from somebody else. But unless they experience it, they won't be giving enough focus to it. So creating simulation and providing such kind of a knowledge to an individual that if they face such kind of attack in their personal life, they should be cognizant of the fact the action they need to take. Their training modules has to be customized in that way. Your monthly emailers has to be like that. And moreover, regulator is very, very focused these days on putting importance to all these cyber attacks and ensuring the organizations are taking right step in order to protect such kind of attacks happening in any of the organizations. Similarly, like we are a regulator-driven organization, IRDA take all the important controls or keep on sending us advisories to take corrective steps in order to protect such an attacks.
Okay, so let's go. Let me go across to Sandeep now. And Sandeep, the question to you, because we spoke in this context. So, what are some of those best practices, with your experience, that you would suggest that companies must follow, given the changing landscape of the last, 18 odd months or so?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for asking the question, and thank you so much for having me in the panel as well. Before I start, so here is the analogy, right? Being a CISO of a SaaS company always makes me feel that I'm a security in charge of a bank with a large number of safety deposit vaults, right? Because each and every customer's data for me is the customer's trust that they have shown in our SaaS environment. So the only difference is maybe in a bank, you can secure it, with the steel walls all around it, no one going in, going out. However, with the all APIs and other connections that we built in our SaaS services, that gets me worried, right? Now you've got all kinds of connections all around it, which makes your data sort of vulnerable, right? So I agree that the biggest question is, as this technology is evolving, how do you protect yourself from these attacks? Now, I know John talked about possibly using, AIs where, a person logging in at a certain time is always noted down. So an anomaly if it happens can be detected. But I'm sure the attackers nowadays are smart as well. I've heard about attackers actually training these models where not necessarily someone who's logging in from Canada would suddenly log in from Australia now. They train the system slowly where the person now starts looking at logging in at the various times. And until and unless you don't catch these things much in advance, it's very difficult to get ahead of it, right? Because it's always a catch-up war, right? That the attackers are getting smarter and the defense is getting smarter as well. Other part is, I think, Unique and Pawan also talked about it, that you are as secure as the weakest link in your organization, right? And typically, these days with technology that we've deployed, it's very difficult to compromise the system itself. it's much easier to compromise a user in terms of persuading him or her as you are someone else. So some of the initiatives or some of the new things that we've taken up are obviously one of that being how do you educate our users, right? And now being in a remote environment, right, where the pandemic hit and all of a sudden we had to have all our employees working from home, was sort of extending our security boundary now, right? So we had to actually not only train people but also assess their home infrastructure, right? Look at their home routers, are their password set correctly, and how do you train them accordingly and things like that. That was number one. Number two is I talked about the catch-up game, right? So one is you work all along, how do you protect yourself, right? But the part two of that is you also have to run often exercises that talks about, God forbid, tomorrow if you're compromised, right? That ransomware attack does happen on you. How would you react? Are you ready from a process perspective? Whom to contact? How do you communicate with your customers? How do you do a damage control? All that stuff together as well. That's the second part of it. Now, obviously, that's the part which you would hope that you never have to use. So while we do spend time on that, we spend a lot of time on making sure that we are further secured, whether it is multi-factor authentications, whether it is encrypting, use of public certificates and things like that. But that's a journey that we have been all along.
Okay. So time, since we've spoken a little bit about so many different issues, time for a poll. And this poll, for all the people watching, it's for them, the members or the experts on the panel. They can't answer the question, nor can I. Here's the question on your screen. You make one choice. What has been the approach of your company towards supply chain security after the pandemic? So the four options are before you: increase spending, raise the fairness, or continue your best practices as you were doing it, and enhanced data protection. So the answers from the people who have exercised the option will come up on your screen in just a while. Meanwhile, we can move ahead with the conversation that we were having. So how do companies have a malware recovery plan that could help them prepare in advance? And I'd like Sachin, you to go for it first, and then of course we will get others to also answer it. Meanwhile, the poll results are also on your screen, and I think if we can wait for a while, that gives you a sense of what it could look like. Sachin, malware recovery plan.
Sure, Ashu. So I think first of all, that really comes down to containing the impact of it, right? So that's where it's very important that you do not have some things which become too central to any of your ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. It's important that the containment of it is something that we have a predefined boundaries for, and are able to say that there is a distributed model through which anything can propagate beyond a point. I think that's quite key. So identifying beforehand, as well as if there is actually an unfortunate situation, to really see what are those key focal points which can actually be able to let propagation happen beyond a particular remit. So defining that boundary is the one aspect of it. Second is really to be able to know what are the services or the, let's say, systems which can actually switch down to a power saving mode, if I can say so, or really be made inaccessible for a while till that is happening. Because there are certain things which you'll say there is some money revenue coming from it, but with a malware attack, it can actually lead to a much bigger cascaded impact. So one has to take some hard calls like that as well. What amongst my services are mandatory, must still be having a level of availability aspect, which ones I should put into some kind of a power saving mode or actually in an offline mode for the duration that we need to mitigate that. That has to be one of the very important first decisions when you get into that. So that's the process part of it, right? And then putting your tools into action to really be able to then see how much it has gone through, accordingly purging that respective data, isolating that, and then curating it is what is important. And then hence saying that, yes, my network to this degree has been impacted. Here are things which can continue functioning. Here are things which we are actually putting in some extended period of time into that mode and accordingly resolving it, right? So I think those are the three things that I would say: prevent centralization and really have a distributed model, be able to really accordingly say that, yes, we have a way to really know which services can go down versus up, and accordingly take some conscious choice on that. And third is really to put those tools to mitigate the malware. Right. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
Okay, John has raised a hand. John, if you can make a quick point, and then I go to Avinash.
Yeah, I just want to extend that point because I think it's a really good one. And the thing with recovery plans is you need to really test them. All too often, we've had these companies that have had recovery plans, but they've never actually gone through a tabletop exercise where you actually run through the plan. I've talked to companies, and in one case, the company said, "Well, we needed to find out how many of our machines were impacted by X." But the one person we needed to call, either we didn't have his number, or they were on the other side of the world and asleep, or so you get to find out where your where the issues lie within your plan if you run through them. And the other thing to bear in mind is as you run through these plans, you might actually realize that what your malware recovery plan helps you do, let's say it's a ransomware recovery plan, it can actually help you with a hardware failure. I talked to another company which ran through a tabletop exercise of their malware recovery plan. A couple of weeks later, they had a total SAN failure, which looks a lot like a ransomware attack because nothing was available, right? So they used elements of that plan to inform the recovery for the SAN failure. So I can't stress enough that if you do have a plan, in which you should, you really need to test it and understand where the pieces are that you can improve on and what pieces are missing.
Okay. Avinash, another quick point about the malware recovery plan. What are some of those key, the pillars on which it should be? And then I, of course, will try and take other aspects of this to Anirban as well.
Indeed. So I think some good points made by the fellow panelists. I would say, I would like to highlight three aspects of this. Number one is a very effective partnering between the security and the infrastructure and application teams. Because what you find is in such a scenario, right, when let's say all hell breaks loose, how does one stitch together the entire recovery plan? There could be need for getting infra on higher on the cloud. There are many elements to how bad your the situation is and how affected your, let's say, servers or systems are. So that's where I found that there itself is a lot of skirmishes going on in terms of how to handle those elements. So definitely having that and having that reasonably ironed out, and that does tie to the point that John was making, that it comes through some kind of a simulation, preparedness and testing that we definitely need to do. I would also tie this back to kind of the question that you asked, that what are companies doing for preparation? That was a whole question that we also had. I would definitely say that the kind of the simulation assessment organizations are able to do, whether it be red teaming, other forms of breach assessment, that they want to do, and then preparation for therefore how the processes will actually work, and getting all the other stakeholders involved, including on the customer side. That is on the enterprise side. There could be the procurement teams that need to be involved in terms of rapid access to certain resources and various other things that they need to do, right? I think that's one part of it. And finally, I think just taking a look, at the existing way in which the supply chain, utilization is being done, because many organizations, and we have people on the panelists on the call also who would probably be using a DevOps approach. There is this push towards innovation, and therefore, there's a lot that the developers want to do in terms of building a software and all that, which means that they would actively go and collaborate on a GitHub. There'll be a lot of work being done possibly on open source stack and all of that, right? However, that's where the kind of the criminals are coming into feed, and that's where they're trying to now plant malware which can take the shape of such kind of attacks. So then tying the security thinking to the processes which are good for the organization in terms of driving and fueling innovation, creation of more digital platforms and software, but the right security framework for that, security tied to that, is what I would say is the three areas of focus that can definitely help.
Okay. Anirban, as you speak to companies, what are some of those very common mistakes that they made? And maybe if you could give it in the context of India, it'll resonate with everyone who we are speaking to here, and of course, people who are watching us as well.
So, sorry, Ashutosh, are you asking this question in terms of malware or?
Yes, in terms of the malware and, some of the challenges faced by companies, the kind of mistakes that they make, well, malware as well, and some of the mistakes with their supply chains and in terms of the kind of security preparedness they have for their supply chains.
Sure. And whatever Avinash and John have shared, if organizations practice that, they probably would have handled everything. But, just to add, the typical mistakes in terms of malware that they make is they are very, very reactive, right? So they don't have a playbook. They don't have a crisis management plan, and which John mentioned about in great detail. So unless that is there, whatever you do is absolutely reactive. It has not been planned and practiced. And that is something which organizations struggle. And the next point is in terms of malware, there are different kinds of malware. It can be a spyware, it can be a ransomware, and so on and so forth. Do the scenarios that they test, that they put down as part of their crisis management plan, addresses all those scenarios? One of my client, and this came from someone which is very, very familiar with the supply chain. They know a lot of things about the environment. So they got a call saying that your customer data is there with us, we are going to upload that data. Right now, it's like a, unless you pay us in Bitcoin, so it's like a hoax ransomware, which is again a kind of malware. Right now, it's a hoax, it's not actual. But do you have mechanisms to detect that it is hoax or it is real? And what do you do in those actions? So practically envisaging about all scenarios is something that they typically miss. Coming back to supply chain security, organizations, we use different products, and there are a lot of instances we heard about SolarWinds and so on and so forth, where the product security, the product that organizations are using, that has got compromised, right? And there is something which is pushed. Now, typically, whenever organizations look at products, whenever I'm acquiring a product, I will look at everything. I will look at security. I will look at what kind of controls are there. Whenever I'm contracting with a new supplier, I will try to make sure that my contract is robust. But over a period of time, the priorities change. And there are cases when these products, these applications are in a sunset mode. They are not supported by recent patches, and my focus goes on something which I'm doing new. For example, I'm trying to replace this product with something else. I'm launching a new application, and I always say that, okay, this is sunset, I don't have to bother about this. But that is something which is often a biggest miss, because there are issues in terms of patching, there are issues in terms of the right focus which is on that product. So these are some of the aspects typically which organizations don't consider.
Okay, so that's something to make note of. It's time for another poll. And as we put up the question for you, just to remind, you might also want to put in your questions for the experts in the Q&A tab, and please feel free to write them, and we'll try and take those questions. So here's the second poll on your screens. How are third-party risks handled in your company? And you have to make one choice only. Access is only permitted to registered devices. Any partner, any of the partners can have an access. The access is driven by profiles that you've created, or are you trying to review the situation all the time? Is that so? You have to make one of those choices. As always, the experts or I, we do not get to answer the question. So this is all about you, and you would like to put in your answers to this. So we'll pop up. Wow, there comes the quick answer. And profile-based access is the overwhelming choice there. And that's at least the audience that's hearing us. That's what they are talking about. So this gives you a sense of what the audience is thinking, and that is popped up on your screen. So let's move on with the discussions. So how should that fundamental change begin for companies? in the way they go about building the newer systems. And I keep saying this because a lot of things are being relooked at. Sandeep, would you like to give a sense of how should companies look at rebuilding afresh, and what is something that they should take care of?
When you say rebuilding what? You're talking about like security?
The IT systems and the way they look at security and the supply chain security.
Gotcha. Fantastic. You asked me a dream question because we often don't get a chance to rebuild something, right? We often get a chance to enhance what is already existing today.
Yeah, in the light of current realities, if I may add so.
Correct. Thank you so much. So I think if I have to rebuild a system completely, and how do you secure it? That perspective, I think some of the aspect we talked about is one is who are your suppliers, right? And these suppliers not necessarily means just the software suppliers, right? I think someone talked about just because you bought an equipment of Samsung doesn't mean it is great and you can start using it straight away. I think your attacks can come from various aspects, right? It can come from a traditional hacker. It can come through a rootkit installed in the firmware of your hardware as well. So I think the first part is identifying the access levels, right? And how do you secure those access levels, whether that's an employee access or it's a partner access, and how do you build the zero trust? Happens to be one of your most important aspect. And zero trust obviously boils down to the people zero trust, the device zero trust, the application zero trust. So even the devices that you're accessing from, how do you secure that only certain devices which are sort of approved are having access to your systems? That's part two. Third is all about the processes, right? Which is, for example, and probably you did a poll at the right time about the partner access, because I think a typical challenge that the companies face many times is in a business, right? In order to move at a great velocity that they want to, would always ask, hey, I need to get a partner in, and by the way, he needs this access. However, it has to be analyzed deep dive, saying A, is access really required or not? B, is it secure or not? Right. So basically profiling these partners in terms of creating their roles and managing their access accordingly based on the roles that is provided to them. It happens to be extremely important part of the entire process. I think these are some of the conditions that you would certainly take into account while building a new IT system.
Okay, that's an interesting take, and let me ask Pawan as well. Pawan, would you like to add to that? On how would you like to add anything more? And of course, any other points that you'd like to add to that?
Sure, Ashutosh, definitely. So though Sandeep has touched upon on most of the aspect, there is one important aspect which I would like to touch base upon is building a security gate while building the new infrastructure. Because what we do is we do security assessment at the beginning of it, and whenever it is regulatory required, or probably may not reassess those particular system at any stage. While I would suggest, in the practice which I prefer to follow is keeps doing security testing on a regular basis. It is not only the first time when we put something in place, we do the security testing, analyzing the kind of connection we require with third-party supplier is very much important. The kind of access we should provide is very much important. Profiling of an individual is very much important. And basis that the access should be provided. Sandeep talked about different phases, different ways what we should look at, and how we should restrict that by putting gates at each stage. But identifying and doing security testing of each gate is very much important at each level. So while we are, for example, we are creating a VPN tunnel, it is good that we create a VPN tunnel between us and the supplier. But what if we don't test it on a regular basis? What if we don't look at what has changed in their environment, and what needs to be relooked at, reconsidered? If we don't consider all these aspects, we may be keeping a gate open with somebody else. What about the employees who are working with our third-party provider servicing us? If we don't relook at those individuals and do the reprofiling of those individuals, there may be one individual moved from one function to another function, whereas we were not being made aware of. if we don't look at it and don't revisit or do not reconcile all these aspects, we may be keeping a gate open. Hence, it is very important. The process plays a very important role, which Sandeep talked about. We have to have a very strong governance process in these stages, which keeps on emphasizing on going back to the basics while we build the setup with a third-party supplier and reassess those aspects and check whether we are following those practices which we thought of implementing, and checking those whether they have been correctly implemented or not, or whether those processes have been correctly followed or not. There are many examples you may see where because of third-party providers, the hacks have happened. Recent one I was reading, there was through a third-party app, it was a CRM software through which the customer data got I forgot the country name. And similarly, with when you outsource your payroll to a third-party provider, you tend to share a lot of data. What if the employee leaves at the service provider, and what happens to that data? Have you ever checked it? Most of the organization have never looked into it. But whereas you have to have a rigorous process, if somebody is leaving the organization, what undertaking are they taking from the employee? Are they ensuring whether the employees are not taking the data along with them? They belongs to a particular organization. For example, in case I take our example, it belongs to us. The service provider cannot take that data, right? Similarly, putting security gates while doing the assessment, putting the right processes, and I would like to touch base upon this while creating a software as well. If we are building something new, we should involve security in the first place. Second, we should have 2 security gates during the SDLC process as well, one at the UAT end, and second before putting the software into production. Now, that software may be developed by internal resources or probably a third-party provider, or maybe we may be integrating a third-party API, which we never look into it because we think, or we consider that the API must be safe because they are using it, they have built it, it's a big organization. We may consider it as secure, but at times we have also experienced that the APIs are not always secure. There may be gates which are open, which we may not aware of, or they may be using a third-party connector, which is vulnerable to different kind of attacks. So those aspects are very important to be evaluated.
Okay. So some questions also coming in. Deepak writes, and he says, companies want to onboard suppliers ASAP, while the access that the system gives them needs time. So here's a situation which is a conflicting kind of a situation, very real business situation. How can that situation be resolved? Avinash, would you like to take that?
Sorry, could you just explain the nuance of the...
Sure. So I think what he's trying to say is that, suppliers who have to be onboarded, it takes a little time for them to go through the process. And, we spoke about the access that the system needs to give to their devices or to the profiles. That takes time, while, the business would want that to begin as soon as possible. How can that situation, it's a very real business situation, how can that be resolved?
Well, the situation does change a lot from industry to industry. For example, if you look at regulated industries, like even telecom and services, right, or banking, etc., there's a certain set of procedures, that one needs to follow, and there's no skipping the legal and regulatory aspects. There's just no, getting around it. So that's one part, that is there. The second thing is that, of course, today, if you look at the innovation work that needs to be done, it needs, reasonable participation from a large enterprise like us, with the startup community also. Because there is talent out there, there's work that is happening, and and then collaboratively one could bring something to fruition in terms of the projects that we are doing. So just rather than just thinking of traditionally, okay, there's a supplier, you want to buy something, let's get something going. Rather than that, it's about what is the nature of work that needs to be done, and whether it is knowledge work or whether it is buying, purchase of products and services, right? There are different kinds of regulations that apply to that. For example, the DOT had come up with this regulation. Obviously, in the interest of national homeland defense, that all the equipment that is bought and deployed on telecom networks needs to go through mandatory security testing and certification. Just no getting around. So when regulations come in place, then it becomes a very different story. But then when you want to get some kind of other kind of strike other relationships for the sake of innovation, that is when how do you build relationship with that kind of, as I said, other smaller organizations, are doing the right kind of work. Again, it has to be a slightly long-term approach, I would say. But then they're collaborating in your IP creation and all that also, and therefore it's fairly sensitive work. That approach needs to be different. So I would say it's a little bit of horses for courses, right? And one needs to be cognizant of the operating business environment of your organization, and in terms of what you want to achieve, and of course, better safe than sorry.
Better safe than sorry. That's very important, that line. It's old-fashioned, old line that we've heard it so often, but surely needs to be kept in mind all the time. Sandeep, as companies see more people coming back to work, and that hybrid working situation now becoming a reality, what are some of those things that companies need to keep in mind? Are they just the same old ones that we've spoken about, or you'd add a few points given this, given the kind of situation that is emerging?
From a security standpoint, I think employees coming back to work is sort of music to the ear, right? I think it makes it better because it gives us a sense of control, a better control than when they were working remotely. I guess the only parameter that we're really working on now is how do you give that sense to employees that they're still at home, right? So how do you break those traditional office walls and give them that feel and comfort for home? But from a security and safety standards, I would say we will always be sort of heightened security alert, but nothing changes by these employees coming back to the work.
Okay, nothing changes. Okay, there are more questions also coming in. Vijay has put down this question, and I'll read it out. If we are outsourcing the services and sharing the employee or organization data to third party, I'm not sure if it can be controlled. If stolen, we can't prove it, or we will not come to know. I'm not sure what exactly the last sentence means, but the point about the data being, well, once you've shared the data to a third party, where does that go and what are some of those implications? Sachin, would you like to take that question? And what could be the implications of that?
Sure, Ashu. I think this is one of the hard problems, and very, very good question. So I think here is my view. First is really to understand transfer versus access, right? These are two different things. One is to say we are transferring data in some form, right? Which traditionally we would say certain files are exchanged with your partner services, or even if somebody is doing some, let's say, some project work for you. It is paramount important that it is not in the transfer form. It's rather something which, where it is hosted, is still within the firewalls of what you provide, and there is some access given, and that's where I think the just enough access is very important, right? It is not an access which is simply assuming that yes, somebody is working with us now, they're just part of the team and everything is fine. That really can fall flat very badly. So it's very important to say what exactly specifically is the access required, and limit that boundary to really say we have provided just enough access, and it's in the access form only, to the degree wherein you invest more into the toolkit to really say whether something is actually downloadable or viewable, right? Of course, there is still a threat about somebody could be taking screenshots, doing the browsing. If somebody's hell-bent on it, they'll find some other ways, right? And that's where it's very important that there is a ephemerality attached to it, which is that nothing is permanently kept in the same places all the time, right? There is a round-robin transfer of how you really do your data, which so to say, I have this it can be as simple to really say I have it available in this dated form or a snapshotted form till the state, and after that it's going to move elsewhere, and that becomes the new one. Accordingly, if somebody needs it, they'll really need to accordingly ask for the newer access for it. So I think simply keeping any access continuous is also not a good practice. It should be something that we are able to refresh after a particular time, right? Last point, I think that correlates, Ashu, to some of the previous questions as well. I just wanted to make sure we kind of spend some time on that. It was really about when we talk about any of the issues that we've talked about, right, I think it's very important to visualize and map, right? Like what is really the interaction that we are having, right? If we don't have it documented, you get into much real situations, and that needs to be living and breathing, right?
Mhm.
The following partners access the systems through the following 3 entry points. There is data transferred of any form in this particular realm, right? So hence what will happen, and I think that's where sometimes things go wrong. If you're having an architecture review discussion or a flow discussion, we tend to have a lot of discussion with respect to, okay, what will the experience look like? What is the system flow? Performant enough or not? All of those things really become very part of the conversation. But the conversation which needs to happen isolated very clearly is really saying that in this, what are my vulnerability points? And that discussion is dedicated to that. So it's very important that we document, visualize, map, and accordingly then be able to reference that, unfortunately, if the real situation also happens, right? I think that's quite key. So that's really is my overall viewpoint on that.
Okay, John, so are companies ready to discuss that point about, the detailing, and are they ready to discuss more of it post-pandemic and post some of the recent turn of events that we've seen?
Sorry, discussing what exactly?
So we were just talking, and making that point. Sachin was making the point about what is discussed more. So we tend to discuss the experiences more, the front end part, but it's the back end where the real work needs to be done. And real work needs to be done to make sure that there are systems in place to make sure security is enforced. So are companies ready to discuss that in as much detail as a company like yours would like to?
I guess it differs from company to company, and it depends really on the maturity, the security maturity of that company. And the security maturity is one of these things that's it's a spectrum, right? It starts with nothing, and then you move forward to well, there's no endpoint. It's actually a journey, not a destination. But as you grow in maturity within a company, you're able to discuss things in more depth and more detail, because you understand your environment better. You understand your operating environment, but you also understand the nuances of what some of the technologies, the processes you're using, how they all come together and interplay within your organization, and how you also interplay with others. So yeah, there are some companies that have a really good handle on that, and they don't just need to talk about the front end, but they can very concretely describe what's happening within the processes, both the automated things that they're doing, the procedural things they're doing operationally. And then there's other companies which just don't have a good handle on that yet. And that is really one of the key aspects to increasing your cybersecurity resilience. Means moving along that spectrum towards a more mature posture, which is understanding what your capabilities are, but also understanding what your potential failures are, or how you're lacking. And lacking is not just technology. It's not that just you're missing a piece of technology, but it's you're missing a critical process that could enable your business to withstand a specific attack. So I think larger companies have a better handle on this kind of thing. Certain industries, like financial industries, have a better handle on this because they've had to do it through regulatory pressure and governance, right? They're basically forced into it in many cases, but also they hold all the money, so they don't want to be losing that money. So there's an added pressure there from their customers as well. But then when you're talking about the smaller, medium-sized businesses, I think that's where it gets a little bit murkier, and where these organizations maybe they need help. Maybe they need to call PwC and say, "Hey, can you help me understand what my situation is, and then how can we incrementally improve it?" It's not a big bang, throw a whole lot of money at the problem kind of solution. It's let's incrementally improve towards a better future.
Sandeep, sorry, I missed you wanted to make a point when Sachin was talking.
Yeah, I think I looked at that question, and I saw the last line which talked about what if we don't have a control, or if the data is leaked. I think in a SaaS world, to give an access to a partner without having a control on the data is a big crime, right? There's no forgiveness for that. Forget partner. I think in the SaaS world, even your own employees, when the access is given to customer data, you have to deploy technologies like DLPs, making sure that all the access is logged so that you can go back and look at exact cause in case the data was leaked from where. There has to be a very strong contractual agreement as well maintained with. So that's what we do. When I outsource some of our SaaS business to external entity, we have a very solid contractual terms. We audit them quite often to ensure that they follow the practices that they claim that they follow the practices. We make sure that the access is only through a secure fashion, through a jump box or something like that, which is completely tracked, and we have full DLP enabled so that data cannot be leaked. As I said, this is a vault where people have kept the money, right? So it's very important for me to track it all the way end to end.
Okay, so we'll also try and see if we can take another poll there. If we have enough time, we'll try and take that. But meanwhile, let me also now. Okay, there the poll pops up. What form of security practices does your company practice for the cloud? Security is layered. Is there a regular assessment? Data identification and encryption happens, and you practice all of them. Well, just to put it in context, this has to be very simple. That's why it has been broken down in the manner that it is. And we will expect people to answer the questions, everyone who's watching us, and try and answer that. Okay, we haven't spoken much about the cloud there, Avinash. That is the direction in which things are headed. If you can give a little context on why it is so important for smaller companies also to be on the cloud, it'll help as well.
So I think, the way to, I would say a pragmatic way to approach this would be, firstly, the reality is that there's a fairly high degree of adoption, and that continues to accelerate as far as cloud services are concerned. Right? There's a lot of incentives being offered also from the various cloud providers or various kinds of platform and function as a service, which attracts different software and IT teams to go there. What that means is, that obviously there is thinking that needs to come in, and maybe it is there in certain enterprises, that what is my security framework and security architecture for the cloud, right? What part of it is something that I would reasonably want to integrate with my enterprise security architecture as well? What part of it is something that I would just leverage as a native solution which is available to me from that cloud provider? So there are these kind of choices which immediately start coming to the fore. Okay, and it is about, I think enterprises need to have the aspiration to reach a certain level of maturity for the security processes and security deployment on the cloud as well. There have been all these models around CIS model, the variety of models of how your enterprise security looks. Are you good? Are you best in class? Are you above average? But that same thinking is evolving around cloud as well, in terms of how that is. So what that means is, yes, the approaches that were applied, let's say the layered approach, or thinking, of course, of data, thinking of the workload, now starting to think of containers, right? Okay, if my workload is so mobile and it gets deployed here or there, it's moving, and the notion around the edge, right? So it's not just about the cloud, now it's about the edge as well. So I would say that it really has to be in the context of, okay, there has to be a framework. Let's get our arms around this in terms of how we want to achieve it. What is the level of speed that we want to have in terms of going ahead with faster and faster DevOps, serverless computing, containers, all the good stuff which is available out there. And where does security stand in all of that? So I think there are some maturity models available, and that needs a very serious look. And the fact that it needs to be effectively managed, because that's a service that kind of you can't shut it down. Anybody could be accessing it from anywhere. Any entity could be connected. So therefore, the notion of really a 24/7 managed service around that becomes very important. So those are some of the key kind of parameters I would like to call out in the context of cloud journey.
Sure. Anirban, the smaller companies would like to, as it becomes easier to access services thanks to cloud being available, you really can scale it up when you want, and several other advantages. What would you advise that some of these smaller companies need to do if they want to move up on their scale of preparedness for such an eventuality?
Sorry, Ashutosh. So you are asking that smaller companies, they can upscale and in a
For
cloud environment.
the security challenge, to be ready for that, because obviously the smaller companies, as some of the other panelists mentioned, they're not as well prepared. But what should they keep in mind in terms of doing it? Step 1, step 2, step 3, maybe, so that they are better prepared in the connected world, in the hyper-connected world.
Yeah, let me just try to answer it, in terms of the cloud environment. Right now, as it has been mentioned, smaller companies, they might be lacking some basic security hygiene. The cloud environment actually offers that. So they will make sure that at least you are at the baseline level. And that is the advantage which smaller organizations can get. Now, if you look at cloud, it is purely modular. I don't have to go for all the types of services, all types of subscriptions together. And I can scale up depending on my maturity. Tomorrow, if I want to start monitoring, if I want to monitor incidents, there are a lot of native subscriptions which are available, and I can take those services. So it also gives me an advantage to subscribe different security services which are available natively in cloud as I grow and as I progress. So these are some of the advantages which smaller companies can leverage in a cloud environment.
Okay, so that's just a broad picture. Obviously, there is too much of detail that needs to be spoken about, and that needs to be specific to specific requirements. We've almost run out of time, so probably let me request John, if you could just put down a vote of thanks for everyone.
Certainly. First of all, obviously, I want to thank all of the attendees for being here today and listening to us. I want to thank my panelists. Great insights. I think it was a good discussion. And I learned a few things today as well. And obviously, Ashutosh, thank you again for the great moderation. I just want to be brief in just a closing sort of sum up of what we talked about today. And the first thing I want to mention is everybody is part of somebody's supply chain, right? This is whether you're a large business or a small business, if you're manufacturing parts, then you obviously know you're part of somebody's supply chain. Or if you're a SaaS company, you're holding everybody's data, you're part of somebody's supply chain. But even a company that just has customers, well, guess what? They're your supply chain. They're the ones you're supplying services to. And then some of the points that were made, I heard this really early on. I think it was really important. It was kind of quick, but it was really important to mention is that not everybody has a CISO. Not everybody has somebody who's in charge of security, of setting priorities for the business. And that's really important. If you don't have that within your organization, you don't have to go and hire somebody right away. There are services you can hire to do that as well, vCISOs. But it's important to have somebody who's got the ability to set policy and priority from a cybersecurity standpoint for the organization, and then has the support of the senior management team to be able to act on those priorities. And then we're talking about assessments, right? Understanding what your maturity is, where your the good things and the bad things lie in your network and in your environment, and really understanding that at a granular level so that you can make incremental change to improve things. And you improve things through people, processes, and tools, right? We talked about people having awareness. Well, awareness is just step one. The next step after awareness is continued vigilance, and it's building a security culture. And Ashutosh, I know you've heard me say this before, but a security culture is where everybody from the loading dock to the CEO understands how they can positively impact the security posture of the organization to make sure that nothing goes wrong. The processes, building, deploying, monitoring systems. How do you do that? How do you do that in a way that conforms with those priorities and policies that you've set previously? And then finally, the tools that you're using, right? Are they furthering your end goal? And if you're just starting out, if you don't have anything, you need to walk before you can run. You need to understand what are the basics that I need to implement first. And then you work your way down and through the line of maturity towards something like zero trust. And again, in a hybrid remote working scenario, that is, I think we all agree, is one of the end goals. It's not going to be for everybody in its complete form, but some of that, things like multi-factor authentication, is for everybody. It's required in 2021. It's not a must-have. And let's not forget that lastly, all of this is dynamic. You need to test, You need to understand where your weaknesses are, and then you need to increment and improve on those weaknesses. And only by doing all of that and more, unfortunately, and that's why security is hard, are we going to be better prepared to battle tomorrow's complex threats.
Okay, thanks, John. And I'd probably like to put it in the context of cricket, which, John, is a very popular sport in India, very, very popular. It's a British sport, very popular. So I'll put it in that. In a typical ODI, in a 50-over match, you try and score 1 run of every ball and you reach to 300. I suspect security is something like that. Slow burn, takes time, but if you do it right, take small steps, possibly you can get home and be safe as well. That's the big picture. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Pawan Chawla, Avinash.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Avinash, Sandeep, Unique Kumar. Of course, he's left us. He couldn't be with us through the entire discussion. Sachin Lala, Anirban Sen Gupta, and of course, John as well. Thank you, everyone, for being with us for this very important discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ashu.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Thanks.